A few years ago, I bought a very cheap copy of President Calvin Coolidge's autobiography at a secondhand store, and since it was relevant to this channel, I thought I might as well do a video about it. I just want to do an overview about it and talk about some of the key points, mostly the stuff about the 1920s and its presidency, and share some of the more interesting excerpts, then finally give my opinion on the book as a whole. But first, let me go over a little background about the book itself. Calvin Coolidge left office on March 4, 1929, after serving as president for 5.5 years, having taken over after the sudden death of President Warren G. Harding on August 2, 1923. Coolidge published his autobiography shortly after leaving office. Compared to previous presidential autobiographies, as well as later ones, Coolidge's was pretty short. For example, my copy has 247 pages with fairly large print, while, for example, Theodore Roosevelt's was 647 pages and Herbert Hoover's was 538 pages. Shortly after its publication, Coolidge's autobiography was actually very successful, and parts of it were even printed in newspapers, providing easier access to it for more Americans. But was this success deserved? I'll give you my opinion at the end of the video. I'm just going to skim over the first half and save most of the attention for the 1920s sections. And besides, there are no big revelations that Coolidge writes about his childhood. His mother died when he was 12, and his younger sister died when he was 18. His father introduced him to government and law, and overall, he said of his upbringing, "It would be hard to imagine better surroundings for the development of a boy than those which I had." Then he goes on about his education and throws in a few anecdotes here and there about hard work and general advice. The most important thing about this stage of his life was going away to a boarding school, which he described as the first great adventure in his life. He also briefly described many of his teachers and what he got out of their lectures. He moved on to Amherst University, and after completing his education there, he eventually established a law office, then slowly climbed his way up the ladder in politics, being in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, then mayor of Northampton, then Massachusetts senator, then president of the Senate, lieutenant governor, and later governor of Massachusetts, vice president, and eventually, of course, president of the United States. On the eve of the 1920s, in late 1919, Governor Coolidge was faced with the pressing issue of the Boston police strike, when 3/4 of the entire Boston police force did not show up for duty. Coolidge was furious, believing that the officers were acting in their own self-interest rather than for the public, which was supposed to be their sworn duty. Metropolitan and state police were brought in after rioting ensued that night, after it became public knowledge that there were few policemen in the city. This had all been the result of the establishment of a policemen's union that associated itself with the nationwide American Federation of Labor, but this had been against the rules that each officer had agreed upon when he entered the force. Coolidge had largely been supportive of labor rights previously, but when it came to those working in sectors owned by the state, especially the police who were in charge of public safety, he looked on their neglect of public duty with disgust, thinking that their actions were detrimental and possibly threatening to the citizens. During the crisis, Governor Coolidge received public acclaim for his rebuttal of the labor union leader Samuel Gompers, writing, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime or anywhere." Coolidge also refused to allow any of the offending officers to rejoin the police force. Coolidge's actions during the crisis and his apparent concern for the public at large helped advance his political position even further, despite the fact that Coolidge himself had not set his sights on public office past the governorship. This would lead him down the road to the highest office in the country. Coolidge described his next nomination in a pretty detailed way, so I'm just going to summarize it briefly. Basically, what happened, he said, was that he was initially supported by many in his state as the Republican nominee for president, but on the national level, he was supported as the nominee for vice president. He wrote that, while he wasn't very interested in being vice president and didn't publicly voice any interest for it, when he received the nomination, he accepted it. That made him the running mate of Senator Warren G. Harding. Coolidge credited race consciousness as a key factor leading to the Republican victory in the 1920 presidential election. By this, he didn't mean Black Americans, but rather the various European immigrant groups throughout the country, who were largely against joining the League of Nations that President Woodrow Wilson had been instrumental in creating. Coolidge wrote, "While they were loyal to the United States, they did not wish to become involved in any Old World disputes, were greatly relieved when the war was finished, and generally opposed to the League of Nations. Such a combination gave us an overwhelming victory." As for his role as vice president, he doesn't really talk too much about it. First, he dispels the commonly held belief that the vice president attends endless dinners and social functions, saying that in his experience, he only had to attend those sorts of events about 3 times a week. But he did say that he enjoyed presiding over the Senate and furthering his education about the functions of government. The biggest revelation of the autobiography is the part when Coolidge is suddenly and unexpectedly sworn in as president. Here's a condensed version of what he wrote about it. On the night of August 2nd, 1923, I was awakened by my father coming up the stairs calling my name. I noticed that his voice trembled. As the only times I had ever observed that before were when death had visited our family, I knew that something of the gravest nature had occurred. He had been the first to address me as President of the United States. He placed in my hands an official report and told me that President Harding had just passed away. My wife and I at once dressed. Before leaving the room, I knelt down, and, with the same prayer with which I have since approached the altar of the church, asked God to bless the American people and give me power to serve them. I had been examining the Constitution to determine what might be necessary for qualifying by taking the oath of office. It is not clear that any additional oath is required beyond what is taken by the Vice President when he is sworn into office. It is the same form as that taken by the President. Having found this form in the Constitution, I had it set up on the typewriter, and the oath was administered by my father in his capacity as a notary public. The oath was taken in what we always called the sitting room, by the light of the kerosene lamp. The Bible which had belonged to my mother lay on the table at my hand. It was officially used, as it is not the practice in Vermont or Massachusetts to use a Bible in connection with the administration of an oath. Besides my father and myself, there were present my wife, Senator Dale, who happened to be stopping a few miles away, my stenographer, and my chauffeur. Personal tragedy plagued the first few years of Coolidge's time as president. First, his youngest son, Calvin Jr., died on July 7, 1924. The boy had gotten a blister on his toe while playing lawn tennis at the south grounds of the White House, which led to blood poisoning. Coolidge hinted that this greatly affected his performance as president, writing, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." In the end, Coolidge and his wife accepted the death as the divine will. Then, less than 2 years later, Coolidge's father died. His health had slowly declined, and his death was expected for a while before it happened. But the president hadn't had time to personally visit him in his last days, having instead to resort to using a telephone. Coolidge felt a huge personal guilt about the death of his son, and deeply regretted the fact that he couldn't be with his father when he was on his deathbed. He somewhat blamed his rising to the office of president for how things turned out. Because his son received his fatal injury while at the White House, he wondered how things would have turned out if the boy had never lived there. Coolidge gives one final statement on the subject of those 2 deaths, saying, "It costs a great deal to be president." Coolidge also gives his general schedule as president, which I have condensed for the sake of time. It was my custom to be out of bed about 6:30, except in the darkest mornings of winter. It was my intention to take a short walk before breakfast, which Mrs. Coolidge and I ate together in our rooms. For me, there was fruit and about 1/2 cup of coffee, with a homemade cereal made from boiling together 2 parts of unground wheat and 1 part of rye. To this was added a roll and a strip of bacon, which went mostly to our dogs. Soon after 8 found me dictating in the White House library in preparation for some public utterance. This would go on for more than an hour, after which I began to receive callers at the office. In addition to the average of 6 to 8, there would be as many from Cabinet and the Congress. About 12:15, those began to be brought in who were to be somewhat formally presented. At 12:30, the doors were opened, and a long line passed by who wished merely to shake hands with the president. On one occasion, I shook hands with 1,934 minutes, which is probably my record. Lunch came at 1 o'clock, at which we usually had guests. About an hour was devoted to rest before returning to the office, where the afternoon was reserved for attention to the immense number of documents which pass over the desk of the president. Before dinner, another walk was in order, followed by exercises on some of the vibrating machines kept in my room. We gathered at the dinner table at 7 o'clock, and within 3/4 of an hour, work would be resumed with my stenographer to continue until about 10 o'clock. For most of the 2 chapters dedicated to his presidency, he mostly just talks about his political philosophies in detail, rather than any specific stories about his time in office. In fact, only about 25% of the book concerns his presidency at all. The book ends with Coolidge explaining why he chose not to run for a second term, which was still a recent announcement when the book was published. He basically just said that it was in the best interest of the people and the country that he didn't seek re-election, and he hadn't really wanted to run that much anyway. My biggest criticism of this autobiography is its lack of details on certain topics. It seems that it was written hastily, especially considering that it was published less than a year after Coolidge left office, and for whatever reason, Coolidge omits many things that could have been very interesting to the reader. For example, he wrote of his time as vice president, "I also came into contact with many of the important peoples of the United States and foreign countries." But that's it. He doesn't list any names or give any interesting stories or observations about those important people. And he also provided very little information about his mother and sister who had died. I can only assume that they played some kind of role in shaping who Calvin Coolidge was as a person, but he doesn't really touch on that subject very much at all. Perhaps his nickname, Silent Cal, holds true in this sense. Perhaps he just didn't feel the need to give a detailed account, but just an account to get some generalities written down. I've seen this in other memoirs of famous people as well. It's as if some of those people don't realize their own importance or involvement in history, or maybe they just didn't think that the reader would care much about certain things about them. But at the same time, the short and simple style of Coolidge's autobiography made it very accessible to people at the time. They didn't have to spend a large amount of money or have a college degree to learn more about their former president. Coolidge said that he strove to keep his memoir brief, simple, and gentle, and also went on to say that he intended it to be a guide for young people, and not just a guide on how to become president. This would definitely explain his scattered anecdotes that act as advice. So, from a historian's perspective, the autobiography is really nothing special. It gives little information about important events and Coolidge's specific motivations. But that's exactly as Coolidge wanted. He didn't write it for historians, he wrote it for the people. I want to end this video with a quote from the autobiography, which I think is especially poignant for these last few years, since the US has had some debates and tensions surrounding the role of the president. So here's President Coolidge's take on that. "The words of the president have an enormous weight, and ought not to be used indiscriminately. It would be exceedingly easy to set the country all by the ears and foment hatreds and jealousies, which, by destroying faith and confidence, would help nobody and harm everybody. The end would be the destruction of all progress." I want to make a quick note that this video was made strictly within the confines of the autobiography, so the information isn't necessarily completely reliable, and definitely not a thorough look at Coolidge's presidency. But this was his life as he wanted it to be presented. And, not unexpectedly, being written by Coolidge himself, there is little to no mention of his failures, shortcomings, or controversies, but that's for another time. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something about the mind of Calvin Coolidge. In the future, I'd like to do a deeper look into his presidency through a more objective and thorough lens, and tell the more well-rounded story of it. I've actually been holding off on this video for a while because I just didn't think it was especially compelling, but I finally got around to making it. I had actually written the script as I read the book about 2 years ago, not long after originally starting this channel, so hopefully it was worth the wait? Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.